Welcome to a chapter in 10. This is a new series where I take a full chapter of the Bible and break it down in 10 minutes or less. If we are just meeting here, my name is Paul and I'm working on my PhD at Yale University. Today's chapter is Psalm 46. I always like to begin with the question, what kind of a text is this? Well, Psalm 46 is what I might call a hymn of trust. It reads as a song lyric that expresses absolute confidence in God. Structurally, if you care about structure, there are three stanzas. There's verses 1 through 3, there's 4 through 7, and 8 through 11. The core theme, I would say, is in verse 1. Verse 1 reads, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. I would retranslate the later half of verse 1 as a well proving to be available kind of help in trouble times. Now, may I say that this kind of help during trouble is not quite about God preventing trouble times or even denying its existence. Because as we see in this passage, it's about God showing up within it. And note verse 1 again. God is our well proving to be available help during trouble times. Verses 2 take the idea up with further elaborations. It says, therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change and the mountains should shake into the heart of the sea. Now, the changing and moving of the mountain is a terrifying imagery. And the poetry, I think, is getting at the worst that can ever happen, where even when the traditionally stable things shake and lose their stability, our fear won't be triggered. I think that's essentially the point. Why? Because in verse 1, God is described as a refuge and a very, very present help in trouble times. Now, after the roaring of the waters and the shaking of the mountains in verses 1, 2, 3, as we have seen, verses 4 abruptly shifts the tone. It says there's a river. Its streams make glad the city of God. This is quite unexpected because there's no literal river in Jerusalem. The city is famously water scarce, relying on springs like Gihon. So the allusion to a river might only be symbolic. That's probably the only way to make sense of it. I am open to being wrong. But I think that it's playing on the imagery of divine presence, of divine provision, or of peace flowing beneath the chaos of the world within the sort of world and the literary world in which the poet is constructing. And all of that is followed in verse 5 with God is in her midst. She will not be shaking, right? The city is personified as a woman, right? I think this mirrors in a broad sense, if you agree with me, Psalm 1's image of the righteous being like a tree planted by the streams of living water. And here, unlike the mountains that change in verse 2 of Psalm 46, this city in verse 5 shall not be moved because God is right there in it, in that city. The nations rage, the kingdoms tremble in verse 6. Now, notice how the language of rowing and chaotic sound again mirrors the waters rowing in verse 3. God's voice in verse 6 rises above the chaos. It says, he utters his voice and the earth melts. Essentially, when God speaks, the storm surrenders. Now, it is after this that we get a full divine intervention in verse 9. He makes wars cease. He breaks the bows and shatters the spear. Now, see here how active God is in war, sort of dismantling the tools of violence with force and actively inventing peace through the means of force, of course. And finally, we arrive at the most quoted line in the psalm, which is verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. The word to be still in verse 10 is from a really weird, word, which is harpu, right? It indicates letting go, to release, to loosen one's grip. It signals a shift from effort to literal openness, to let a thing go. I bring this up also to say that the word shares similar root or root origins with another popular word in the Hebrew Bible, which is the word rapha, a verb that often is translated as heal. In most places, rapha occurs as God restoring a range of different things, human bodies, communities, or even entire physical lands or physical spaces. In Exodus 15:26, for example, God calls himself the one who restores, who raphas, right? In Second Chronicles 7:14, Rapha refers to repairing a land struck by a drought and disease. Jeremiah 14, verse 19, it expresses the longing for national repair after great disaster, namely the exile. Now, these uses show us that Rapha describes God's power to bring back things into the right order, not just sick bodies, but all things needing repair. In other words, Rapha means to make life possible again where it had collapsed. So back to verse 10 of Psalm 46. Remember that it follows verse 9, where God is breaking bows and burning chariots and causing wars to cease. And so the call to be still comes in the middle of collapse. The hearer, or perhaps all of us, the one experiencing collapse via military force in this verse, is commanded, an imperative, remember, to let go, to be still, because God's work of repair is in process. And I cannot finish this thought without going to the other half of the same line, which is, know that I am God. Notice that this is about knowledge. It's about knowing. This is the kind of knowing that changes one's posture mentally and spiritually. It's a reorientation. Essentially saying, accept that you are not in control. And while that might seem terrifying, it's actually good news, because the God who speaks over chaos in verse 6, the one who dwells in the midst of the city in verse 5, is the same God who is with us and is in control in verse 7 and verse 11. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in another episode. Peace out.